Hello, my name is Kristina Gorey, and in this video, you'll see the results of experiments that I ran over the course of a year with a new class of electronic devices called memristors. During this time, I fabricated multiple test devices using materials and techniques available to any competent maker, ranging from jello to graphene and graphite oxide. The goal was to create a macro-scale memristor. Some of the resulting devices exhibited memristive effects. I'll dive into the details in a moment, but first, let's take a quick look at what memristors are. Sometimes, when information is organized in new ways, we see gaps in our knowledge. One example of this is the periodic table of the elements, where these gaps led Dmitry Mendeleev to correctly predict the existence of new elements. In 1971, Dr. Leon Chua of UC Berkeley made a new table of the three fundamental circuit elements, the capacitor, the inductor, and the resistor, and saw a gap. He hypothesized that there was an as-yet undiscovered circuit element that he named the memristor, and there it stood for over 4 decades. In 2008, a team at HP Labs, led by Dr. Stan Williams, was looking for an electronic device that would model a human synapse, or brain cell. They tested a version that didn't operate like any circuit element they'd ever seen. You can guess that they discovered the first memristor. Let's take a quick look at the fundamental circuits to see what's unique about a memristor. A capacitor stores energy in the form of charge differences between conducting plates. When voltage is removed, that energy is released, meaning that current continues to flow at zero applied voltage. The inductor stores energy in its magnetic field as voltage is applied. It too has current flow energy, even at zero applied voltage. The memristor, like a resistor, stores no energy. When the applied voltage goes to zero, no current flows. What makes memristor different from a resistor is the pinched hysteresis loop, where the resistance changes in a stable way depending on how much current has flowed through the device. The first memristor was made out of titanium dioxide, or TiO2. TiO2 is an insulator. However, if you make the device using titanium with oxygen vacancies, the resulting TiOX is a conductor. More TiO2 drives higher device resistance, and more TiOX drives lower device resistance. When voltage is applied to the memristor, the oxygen vacancies migrate, which causes the device to become more conductive and the resistance to become lower. This resistance value stays the same, even after the voltage is removed or some negative voltage is applied. When an opposite voltage is applied for a period of time, the oxygen vacancies return to their original positions, causing the device to once again have a higher resistance. Memristors are identified by this pinched hysteresis loop, where the resistance changes based on total charge and remains stable after the voltage is removed. This makes it a great candidate as a computer memory, the goal of most memristor research today. Teams working on memristors today are trying to make devices that are as small as possible. Over the period of a year, I tried to do the opposite and experimented with creating a macro-scale memristor using readily available materials. Initially, this was 2 types of jello. I chose jello because it was non-toxic, easily available, and seemed a reasonable analog to titanium oxide. And also, I could snack on the leftovers. Here, I used clear, flavorless jello as the high-resistance, non-conducting equivalent to TiO2. To simulate oxygen vacancies, I used lime jello. I then cooled each in a small glass tube, see the top right, and used small screws to create an electrical connection to them, as you can see in the bottom right photo. I took these jello devices and connected them in a circuit consisting of a constant voltage source in series with the jello device and a multimeter to measure current. To keep the jello from liquefying, I covered it with a bag of ice or heat sink. Finally, I used a timer to apply the constant voltage for 10 seconds per data point, as memristor is based on total charge flow through the device, rather than just voltage applied. The early results were disappointing. It takes quite some time to fully cycle a cell through the range of voltages, and none of the cells showed memristive effects on their first cycle. It was only after some time I came back and retried some early cells that they showed memristor. This was confusing, but on further investigation, I found research stating that some memristors require a forming step before they will exhibit memristive behavior. It's believed they need to form filaments in the material that will enable memriscence. To test that hypothesis, I put an unformed cell under a microscope and videotaped what happened at the boundary between the lime and clear jello. Memristors are hypothesized to occur either through a general diffusion of the oxygen vacancies or by filaments of the conducting material reaching out to form a connection across the non-conducting material. My conclusion was that memriscence in jello had more filamentary than diffusive character. The 8 cells I tested did exhibit some level of memristive behavior, but the results were not very compelling. The difference between the high and low resistance values were very small, and the endurance of the device, or the number of times it could be cycled, was rarely more than 2. The key takeaway is that clear and lime jello doesn't make a good memristor. Jello consists mostly of water, which electrolyzes, or breaks into hydrogen and oxygen atoms at a relatively low voltage, a discovery that came, unfortunately, at the cost of a few test devices. Jello has to be kept cold, or the heat of the current liquefies it. This also cost me a test device, but gave me a vehicle to test memristive behavior in liquid jello. None was observed before the jello drained out the ends of the tube. The lime and clear jello boundary tended to break down after a couple of cycles, or, in the parlance of memristive devices, it had low endurance. Most importantly, the memristive effect was weak. Creating a jello memristor had been a fun project, but it had led me to read more about memristors as neuromorphic devices, the purpose for which they had initially been invented. I decided to take a shot at creating a practical macro-scale device that I might use for that purpose. I identified graphene and graphite oxide as candidates because graphene is an oxygen-deficient conductor and graphite oxide is an insulator. My hypothesis was that graphite oxide would migrate through graphene under current to create memriscence. In all, I tested 4 different graphene and graphite oxide devices. 2, labeled 1A and 1B, were pure graphene and graphite oxide. Of those 2, device 1A bonded the electrode to graphene and the other to graphite oxide. Device 1B bonded the electrodes to graphene with a layer of graphite oxide between. I'll talk more about the devices labeled 2A and 2B later. To convert graphite oxide to graphene, I first cut a mylar stencil in the shape of a DVD and covered it with liquid graphite oxide, carefully using gloves, as graphite oxide may be a skin irritant. I then left the graphite oxide in the sun to dry. After the graphite oxide had dried, I mounted the mylar stencil on a blank DVD disc and ran it through a LightScribe DVD writer. The heat from the LightScribe writer converted some tracks to graphene while leaving other tracks as graphite oxide. I then cut segments of the mylar out and mounted them between glass slides with electrodes attached. Here you can see a close-up of device 1A as well as a schematic. In this case, the electrodes were attached to a wide strip of graphene and graphite oxide. The result was essentially a resistor with very mild memristive effects, not much better than the jello device. I hypothesized that the problem with device 1A was that the one electrode was connected directly to the graphite oxide insulator and didn't allow the material to properly move under voltage. So I built a test device where the electrodes connected to 2 thin graphene conductive strips separated by a strip of graphite oxide. The result was unfortunately a resistor with no memristive effects. I looked around to see if anyone had published research in this area, and found work on a variety of graphene and metal memristors. My next step was to build 2 test devices using a brass base with graphene and graphite oxide layered on top. See devices 2A and 2B. I obtained a thin sheet of brass, cut it into small squares, and placed a drop of graphite oxide in the middle. After it had dried, I cut a hole in cardboard of various diameters, held it over the graphite oxide, and used a photographic strobe flash to convert the graphite oxide not covered by the cardboard to graphene. The result was a bullseye of graphene surrounded by graphite oxide that was bonded to the brass sheet. I then mounted the device on a slide and connected electrodes, using paper to insulate them from other materials they might pass over. Device 2A connected the two electrodes to the graphite oxide and graphene, respectively. The hypothesis was that the brass plate would supply conductive material to the insulating graphite oxide to create a memristor. The result was a pure insulator. The graphite oxide apparently stopped any current from flowing through the device. In hindsight, this should have been expected because there was no current flowing through the brass base. For device 2B, I connected the two electrodes to the brass base and graphene, respectively. Device 2B showed pronounced memristive effect, with a pinched hysteresis curve very similar to memristance curves predicted and demonstrated by researchers. The device required a forming step before showing memristance, consistent with research describing filamentary metal ion migration through graphene in copper and graphene memristors. Its endurance needs further testing, as it takes about 30 minutes of manually changing voltages, setting the timer, and recording the resulting current for each data point. During the year, I achieved my objective of demonstrating a convincing macro-scale memristive device. Of the materials I tested, the brass and graphene was clearly the best and used readily available materials with simple construction techniques available to any maker. Determining whether any of these are practical neuromorphic devices depends on automating the data collection, perhaps with Arduino or Raspberry Pi. For now, it takes too long to manually collect full cycles of data to go any further. Or perhaps I'll have access to real test equipment in the university lab where I study next year. Thank you for watching this video. During the year,